Do I intrude upon your rest? Or would you care to talk?
What I've learned through your instruction reasserts again that big and small are only the two sides to the one coin. And that the elephant, for all his mighty strength's no different, basically, to the tiny flea. So still I seek the force, the reason governing life's flow, and not just its external show.
The governing force, the reason. Some things can't be known. They are beyond your reach even when shown.
Why should that be so?
They lie outside the boundaries that words can address, and man can only grasp those thoughts which language can express.
What? Do you mean that words are greater yet than man?
Indeed they are.
Then what of longing, or affection, pain and grief? I can't describe these, yet I know they're in my breast. What are they?
Without substance, as mist is.
In that case, man is only air as well. What has made me thirst, then? To be instructed in those things that are more than speech allows.
Your thirst is artificial, fostered by the arrogance in you. So look no further than all your human brothers do. Sleep, eat, drink, and let that be sufficient.
Liar and foul traitor! Where are the pulse and core of nature you promised to reveal? Where?
Faustus, you lack the wit to see them in every blade of grass.
Vile phantom, lying fiend.
Faustus, worm, dare you rain curses down on me? Now spite and venom deeper than the sea I'll vent on you.
I'm learning. The devil knows no more than we poor fools.
The man who gives his soul to Satan for instruction. I would agree with you, he is a poor fool.
As a guide to higher truths, I really cannot recommend you. And yet, says my contract, signed in blood, you still remain constrained to serve me.
Serve me then.
I will make use of your deceptive guile and your satanic anger.
Both will I put at your disposal.
Welcome back to the Bio-Individual podcast. You're with Kevin and Alex. Hope you've all had an excellent week. Having a normal one. I've been trying to have a normal one. I don't know about you, Kevin. Have you been having a normal one too, or things not so normal?
It's just been a complete and utter normie, I'm afraid.
It's such a burden being a normie. Having a normal one. Did you sort that dog out down the road? I haven't heard it thus far during this recording, which is good.
I couldn't possibly comment on here.
Can neither confirm nor deny. Yeah, good idea. You don't know who's listening. So this is going to be, in some way, I guess, a continuation of last week. I guess a bit of a refinement. I think the general idea is, since we spoke about different systems, kind of like different physical systems, and what works and what doesn't, and we spoke a little bit why certain things work better than other things. Today, I think we're going to focus on something that is kind of related to all of this, and we're building on top of what we did last week. Part of what we discussed was the idea of language-based systems for change and body-based systems for change. And today, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but I think we want to kind of go through why one probably works better in most situations, and maybe the other perhaps less effectively, less often, and perhaps why an optimal system would include both of these things. in their proper context. So do you want to maybe kind of add on to what you were trying to get at this week? Because you were the one that mentioned that you wanted to dive deeper into this issue.
So we were talking about whether you can just, maybe it was on Twitter, we were talking about this as well, that people seem to think you can just, if you read enough books, you will change yourself. Or if you get enough ideas, you'll change yourself. It's a kind of assumption people make, especially younger guys, because you just don't know any better when you're young. You assume you get in the information from enough books. You eventually, you somehow absorb it, and you will then be able to change your life and do different things based on the books. It's once you get a bit older, I'm 42 now, and I can say categorically that you can read hundreds of books. I don't know how many books I've read, maybe 1,000, and you do not get, it does not directly change you in the way that you think it might. When books do help you change, you're probably doing something anyway, and the book just spurs you along or goes alongside it. It's kind of a delusion to think you're learning and changing from the book, really, without doing anything. So what we really need to do is to learn to do things that change you, and obviously books can be helpful for that.
Sure. I think part of that story is one of emphasis. And I know what you say about being old, which I am also, thankfully not as old as you yet, but I probably won't be too long until I'm there. But increasingly, as I get older, for sure, the book thing it never worked for me, but it is still important in some way. And I think this story is definitely one of emphasis. The audience may recall that last week we spoke about all the parts of the human being working kind of in synergy. And rather than ignoring one part of what our conscious experience and ways of interacting in the world includes, and rather kind of integrating all of these different things together. And part of that is body work, sorting out diet, a little bit of exercise, but also not to entirely not include the intellect or reading. But a part of that story is how do you balance all these things together? And today I kind of also wanted to talk about why, from a neurophysiological perspective, perhaps reading and speaking is not as effective as what we think. And I hope that in later parts of this recording, we can go through that in a bit more detail, because I've got some interesting studies here, which is also something I wrote about in my short ebook. So in your experience, and this is interesting, Kevin, because I'd denied intellect. So I went through that whole binary for a while. So I went from hyper intellectual, like a lot of guys on Twitter, and then I went to just fuck it all. I'm just going to not bother reading anything and just practice and just meditate and do stuff like that. And then I kind of discovered that I think both these extreme ends of this binary incorrect, or there's suboptimal ways of approaching self-transformation. What have you found, like, in your practice? How do you integrate intellect into what you do?
Yeah, I went through a similar phase, a hyper intellectual, physically, like hyper tense, muscular habit patterns, and hyper intellectual. The two things often go together. And then eventually, reacted against that and went the other way, tried to get rid of all the thinking stuff. I stopped reading for ages. Went from reading constantly to stopping reading really for only I read a couple of books referred back to a couple of books for 2 or 3 years. Didn't really read much at all. Got really into bodywork kind of things, try to throw away escape from this pesky mind business and all this words of the problem, and you're stuck in your head, that kind of thing. But then eventually you realize that you're in a way, you're just stupefying yourself if you trying to get rid of all that. I understand why people do it. And if you get into like certain kinds of, especially Eastern practices, if Westerners get into Eastern practices, they tend to fall for a lot of this as well. And then eventually you realize, well, you're human, you can't exist without thinking in words. It's just something that we do. You're constantly making concepts. Even if you think you're sitting down looking at sensations, you're dealing with concepts all the time. You have a conceptual understanding of what's going on. You're not really dealing with raw sensations. Even when you think you are, you're already interpreting them in some way. So it's not factually true to think that you can escape these things as a human. But the point is to get them in balance and to understand them both. So the way I look at it now is, you live as a whole, your life is whole. When you have a thought, the thought is whole until you start putting it into words, and then it becomes, you break it down into parts, and understanding, explaining in words is sequential, whereas the thought is whole, but the words are sequential, and you break it into parts. And then the problem is, then the idea would be then to go back to the whole, to use the words, to use the concepts which distinguish different things in the world and help you plan actions and do things. And then you use those words to help you do something in the world again. So you're whole again, you're living as a whole. So there would be a kind of cycle from the whole to the parts, back to the whole. The problem is everyone got stuck in the parts, which for us here is words, thinking in concepts, and they've kind of got detached from the sort of living process. So the mistake people make is when they realize that they're lost in words and caught up in the concepts, they try to just destroy those, to extinguish those, and then hoping that everything will just be fine without that. And the mistake, the traditional mistake that's been going on in the West for a while now is the over-the-top, words-obsessed, the things resulting from a kind of general mind-body split, where everything's way too conceptual and way too much theory and not enough practice, and people don't know how to turn theory into practice. So there's basically just two ways of doing it wrong, and the point is to go from what to the whole to the parts and back to the whole, to go from the theory into practice, and then back to theory with a sort of new theory that helps you with the next practice, that type of thing. So the way I see it now is rather than try to fix it in yourself right now forever, it's more a process that you're going through where you're kind of you're using words to do things, to accomplish things, and then you're going back to the whole lived world, and then you're using words and concepts and breaking things apart to accomplish things, and then you're going back to the whole. That's the way I look at it now.
So for me, I look at it in much the same way. I like the work of Alfred Korzybski. I think that he has a really good model of language, and some of the problems associated with it, and why language sometimes confuses the user as to what its purpose really is. But I like his idea that the language that human beings use is primarily operational, which is to say that there is an action that has to be undertaken in space-time, and language is a way of time binding, so communicating to others in the present and in the future about how to conduct an operation in space. And the way that he looked at things was that it's kind of when people don't understand that language is primarily operational, and don't get me wrong, it can be for fun and pleasure as well, but it's fundamentally operational. It's so you can survive, right? That's the reason we have it. It's a survival tool. But when people basically, and it's the famous adage, right? It's mistaking the map for the territory, or eating the menu at the restaurant. It's this old problem where people mistake, or humans, me included, mistake the map that's being presented to us, so our words and concepts, the way that we describe things, with the territory, with reality itself. And I see this as a real problem today. Interestingly, I was rummaging through some neurology papers, and this one neurologist I was reading was kind of describing our language based left brain, which is something I want to talk about a little bit later. But and it's kind of an oversimplification because all the brain's connected in all different kinds of ways, and it's not like language is just in the left hemisphere. It's not necessarily how it works, but it's a good approximation. And he was describing that from an evolutionary point of view, human beings have quite an efficient modeling and mapping system, or a system of abstraction, of which language plays a part in this picture. And what he described us as hypothesizing animals. So we kind of go around making hypotheses about the way that things are. And we go out into reality, and reality itself either comports with our model or it doesn't. In which case, we're spurred by all sorts of feelings to reevaluate our model of reality, our model of how we're operating in reality. And I like this because it does pretty efficiently describe, I think, what's going on. Because if you think about it, just from an everyday point of view, you have concepts in your mind, you have ways that you interact with the world. And really the only time that you notice that that something is different is when something pops up that doesn't fit into your model. And I think we have this experience all the time. It's kind of like, here is my model of going to the gym. You may expect people to be there. You may expect it to look a certain way. But maybe they replace the equipment one day. They put in some different equipment. The place is disheveled and not in a good state. And this sets off, I suppose, a certain cascade where you have a certain surprise about what's going on. And therefore, looking at the new equipment, looking at people put in new equipment, then you're setting up a new model of what's going on. And as far as I'm concerned, this is widely applicable to how we operate in the world, and particularly the way that we use language in this scenario is pretty important, because language plays a big part in this, particularly when we do more complex calculations and theories and stuff like that. And we need to be a little bit careful, and we need to be a little bit flexible about the way that we use language for this reason, because it is only really ever an abstraction. It's not something that is objectively true. As much as people want it to be, it's definitely not. And we'll go into why this is the case a little bit more. Just quickly before I hand over, there are some really good experiments out there, particularly in split brain patients, which are really fascinating. This is where they split the corpus cabellum, the connecting part between the two hemispheres of the brain. And I find it stunning that this is really not better known, because these studies really point out how the left hemisphere of the brain, which is very symbolic, symbol using, it tends to take everything after the fact. So after everything's happened, after all the subconscious calculations have been done, and it kind of models, it kind of makes up a story after the fact, once everything has been done, which to me is fascinating. And as soon as I read that, I'm like, well, I can't really put much stock into the stories I tell myself about the philosophies that I think, the world should live by, this philosophy or this model of language. Because, in a way, we're just making up stories the whole time, particularly about ourselves and the way that we interact with reality. So I just thought I'd finish with that. If you want to build on that, or...
Yeah, you're talking about confabulation.
Yeah.
I love that word. So yeah, you just kind of make up a story after the I can't remember, one of the examples I read as well was something like they'd had a stroke and only one side of their brain was working. Only the left hemisphere was working, and they couldn't move their right arm because your left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Most people. They couldn't move the right arm, and rather than just say that I can't move it, they were denying that they'd had a stroke. They were just saying it wasn't their arm. They were just making up stories denying it was their arm and things. And this is just like part of the brain isn't working. So but they're still there and they have an opinion. So the two sides of the brain maps onto what we were saying earlier. Well, what we were talking about earlier about the whole to the parts. It's just similar. Your left hemisphere is breaking things into parts. The right hemisphere is dealing with things in wholes. Roughly, if anyone's interested in this, the best book is The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. It's amazing. Again, with that book, people are making the same mistake. Most of the people who like it are obsessing over the right hemisphere thing and making things whole and getting away from the words. He doesn't do this, but a lot of his fans do this, and they're going the other way, and everyone's obsessing over embodied stuff and getting away from words and stuff. I think they're misunderstanding him and the issue. Half your brain is based on breaking things into parts. You're meant to do it. An example is he talks about, in that book, he mentions how birds have the hemisphere split as well. And in like the metaphor he uses for in general is that they use the right hemisphere for seeing things as a whole, which for them is looking around. So when they're trying to eat something, they're using the right hemisphere is on alert, looking around the whole environment around them, checking for predators. But the left hemisphere is the one that's looking for the piece of food that's in the gravel on the ground. Like it's trying to distinguish one specific part from all the other parts. But you can't just have one and the other, because if you're focused too on the food, you'll get eaten, you'll become food. And if you're only focused on making sure a predator's not coming, you'll never find the food that you're looking for. So you need both working at the same time, and this is the reason why this is his theory or somebody's theory of why we have the two hemispheres in the first place. So you can do two ways of thinking at the same time. They're kind of opposites, but you need them both, and they kind of work in a process. So this is the same thing for us, and if you're wanting to change yourself in kind of like a real way, I don't know how to describe this to distinguish it from self-improvement that everyone talks about, which isn't really, extreme self-development, let's call it, where you really want to change yourself. You have to use both ways of thinking, and you have to don't think you can just live in the words part without doing the action part as well. But you can't just do the action part without words. So like words are tools as well. They're like we use concepts in order to do things in the world. So like to go back to the issue about reading is the difference between books and actions is you have to understand what words are for. What is reading and what is writing? So we live in this now, and we don't really think about what it is. The best way to think about it is it's written speech. So like I know people write differently than how they speak, but it comes from speech, and so you have to understand the origins of speech and how it developed in order to really understand what the real function of writing is. So the child learns to speak at the same time as he's learning how to do things practically in the world. So obviously you're not born speaking. The first thing a child does, they have a kind of practical intelligence where they're manipulating objects in the world and figuring out how to get things. But it's very like based on what they can see and feel right in the moment, similar to an ape. So like there's I've heard it described an ape by can't remember his name. Can't remember the guy's name, but he says the ape is a slave to its visual field. So the ape can only do things with what it sees. So like, it can use tools kind of, but doesn't use tools in the same way as we do. It just sort of picks things up and bangs them around based on what it can see. This is what children do when you're young before you can learn to speak. But then when you learn to speak, you don't need to you're not longer a slave to what you can see. You can use the concepts to simulate ideas, to make models of possible futures and then try them out. And then over time, the planning, using speech in your mind, planning comes before the actions. So like the kid will go through the development of, it learns speech from outside, from other people. It's a social thing. And then they'll go through a stage where if they're trying to solve a problem that's a little bit too hard for them, they'll end up speaking to themselves or whispering to themselves, try to figure it out. Some experimenters watched children doing this, and they found that the more complex the problem was, the more they spoke to themselves. So that shows that the child, they're not just what the old researchers thought this meant was the speech talking just accompanies action. They're like two separate lines of development, and you're just like narrating a story along with the action. But actually, they're using the speech. A human child is using the speech as a tool. So they're using sticks and concepts, whereas an ape would just be using the stick. So so the child learns to, first of all, he gets speech from outside, then he speaks to himself, and then the speaking to himself becomes silent in his head. We just call this thinking, leaving aside whether it's really thinking most people are doing. But the idea is it's speech that's become internalized, so you can call it inner speech. And then, there comes a time in somebody's life when they no longer have inner speech or outer speech, spoken speech. All that's left is your written speech, and in books or whatever. So these are useful because you can take what someone's learned and use it for yourself later. So this gives us the illusion that we can just take a book that someone has written about their practical experiences and things they can do, and just take the end product of their life of all this action and just read the words into our head, and now we're at the same level as they are now, because we've read the end product of all the actions they did, the book at the end. People, when you say it like this, obviously no one believes this explicitly, but the fact that people will read a book once and then say, oh, this book's the best book ever, it'll change your life, everyone should read this book, and then they don't read it again, shows that they implicitly think that now they understand that book more or less the same as the author writing the book. So in a week or two of reading it, you've now understood what maybe took a guy 10, 20 years of thinking, writing, and doing things to figure out. So that's like a delusion based on thinking that the words are the end product, when actually they're just a tool. Like the speech that the child learns is a tool. The adults ask it to do things. Adults manipulate the child's behavior using words. The child starts responding to words. It does what it's told. It stops doing some things that it's told to stop doing sometimes. And then eventually it does that to itself. So it's like it can now master its own behavior, because you tell yourself not to do things and you tell yourself to do things, and you go, I wonder if I do these things, if I put those things together. And now he's imagining and making models and simulations of things that aren't there in front of him. That don't exist in front of him, possible situations that an ape can't do. An ape is just banging around. It's a slave to its visual field, what it can see in front of it. To be fair, though, most people are behaving like an ape all the time, because they have a problem and they just directly try and solve the problem straight to the end, rather than figuring out the best way of doing it, and taking an indirect method. And that's like one of the main differences between humans and apes is humans can take detours to solve a problem, to get something, in a way that apes can't. And what is it that allows you to make the detours? It's words, concepts. You can't do it without them. And just to finish, one related to neuroscience that you were talking about, that kind of proves the point, is they did research years ago with people who'd lost the ability to speak in their brain. I don't mean they were something wrong with their mouth, but they'd lost the ability to speak. So you would think, if practical intelligence, using tools with your hands, physically manipulating the world, if that was separate from your speech, you would assume when someone lost the ability to talk, they would just be able to do the same things, they just can't talk or read or whatever. But what actually happened was, when you give them a new task, they get completely confused and don't know what to do. Whereas before they would have just figured out what to do because they'd done things like this before. So if it's not something they've done before that they can do in autopilot, they have to think about, they get completely confused. They try and do things directly. They start banging things around, basically, and start behaving like an ape, because they can't think using concepts and imagine and model situations that aren't there right in front of them. They've become a slave to the visual field again. So if people are trying to become more evolved and more develop themselves, and their goal is to get rid of all the speech, you're literally devolving to do that.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to put it. I hadn't heard of that experiment before. That's fascinating. Yeah, it's kind of language is time binding, to use Korzybski's terminology as well. I mean, if you want to build a bridge, you're not just going to figure out how to build a bridge and then do it yourself. Like, this is many generations of human beings passing down knowledge and building a bridge from those learned lessons, and using symbols to convey that to each other and to further generations down the track. And in this sense, I think, I'm not sure if you agree with this, but just going back to the idea that language then, in a way, is first of all an abstraction. And we do these abstractions by creating categories, and we use categories to file information about the world, and then we hypothesize with this information. But primarily the reason we do it is because we're trying to create an outcome. It's primarily operational. And I think that language has, as Dr. Hyatt used to put it, very sneaky purposes, because it can also have the opposite effect, where we can start believing things about ourselves that are self-defeating. We believe them objectively as if they're objectively true. I mean, we all know about, the studies about memory and how unreliable it is. And it's interesting how the way that we interact with the world, in the way that you're describing and using words and concepts, also is tied up with our sense of self, which is something I did want to get at. I guess the general theme is that language is a tool that we use, and we just need to be careful that we don't get used by it.
It's become detached, intermediary step between planning an action and doing an action, and then becomes attached to people's emotional dramas and becomes attached to their muscular tensions, and then you just end up in this cycle of, lots of people have the negative self-talk, out of control, monkey mind, as the Buddhists or whoever say. So this is, I would say, that's like the language function being dysfunctional. Rather, what I was talking about earlier would be like the would be functional use of language. But for a lot of people, obviously, it's completely dysfunctional, and a large part of the culture is dysfunctional. And a lot of people are try to deal with this by going the pendulum swinging too far the other way now and try and get rid of it all. So I find myself rebelling against the rebels in this regard, because whenever it goes one way then the other, and it's not about being in a sort of mushy grey zone middle area centrist position. It's not that. It's more, you need both, but it's like the process of them both interacting through time. It's not like it's a process that goes on through time in the person himself and in a culture, and there's no escaping it. We're condemned to use words.
I think from what I've picked up in my reading, ironically enough, I guess, is that the left brain, I think, it really can be seen as a bit of a categorizer. Like it's kind of just incessantly categorizing. And I think it, as I was saying before, it goes around, it makes convenient categories so we can kind of orient ourselves in the world. But I've noticed a tendency with people to just build up layer on layer of kind of useless abstraction. And during their time of doing this effectively, the way that they act in space, their relationships, their job, really how they feel about their self or their emotional states, they don't really change. I mean, you kind of get like a sugar rush from reading or saying something or having a banger on Twitter or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, everything is pretty much the same. It's at homeostasis. So in this sense, I think that breaking down language in individuals or a period of not using it so much, whether maybe that's on retreat for meditation or something like that, is actually very useful in empowering down that circuitry, for lack of a better word, and kind of starting to see many of these things in context. And obviously one of the ways you can do this is with a course of body work, because it's all kind of the same thing in a way. But I've seen a lot of people online talking about how, I think it was Hegel or someone like that, who's, I would say, a particularly bad example of what we're talking about, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe you like him. I'm not sure. I've never actually read him. I've read stuff about him. But this kind of compulsion of people where they talk about how they've kind of figured out the structure of reality. I've actually seen people say that before, how they've figured it out by combining different philosophies and stuff like that. And I think it's actually quite common. But I think for all the reasons we've discussed, it's also quite misguided. And I think that in the strictest sense, all language really is, and the self-reference we have using language is really just a form of map making. The maps can be fun, they can be awful, they can be dysfunctional, they can be highly functional. But essentially, you're just categorizing incoming data. And I hate to reduce things in such a materialist way, but I just think it's a really good metaphor. And in this way, I think that we can really zone in on our language, and we can really start to become very efficient about how we use it, in what situations we choose to use it, how we employ it for other people to get a certain effect. But part of the difficulty in this is if you have terrible maps, which many people do, and which I had, as a youth, I had shocking maps, and like, the question is, how do you power this down? Because, you know, these maps and these language patterns, and as you were saying, the language, how it's tied up with the human body and muscular tensions and all various other things like that. Your left brain in this situation is very much a tyrant. It's very much making up bullshit stories. There may have been reasons why you made up these stories as a kid to protect yourself or whatever it was, but they're not serving you anymore, right? They're now ruling you, and you just can't break out of them. And again, I see a lot of self-loathing online in this respect. A lot of young guys that are wasting their time with self-loathing, and you can see them state their beliefs about themselves online, which I think is a bit of a shame. But just to go back to the map not being the territory, do you find that your body work pulls people out of that frame of the left brain dominating them, and them, or whatever them is, being unable to break out of these patterns?
Can I go back to something you said earlier? You talked about doing some kind of meditation retreat or something like this to kind of break up the domination of the language, you know, like to being obsessed by to power down the current models and what you have, whatever, the kind of maps. This definitely, yeah. I mean, there's loads of things like that. Sometimes you just need to sometimes you have to go through a destroying phase and then a destruction phase, and sometimes you have to go through a construction phase. And sometimes they're combined together. It just depends where you are. And this is something will probably come up a lot in the way we talk about this. So it's worth saying explicitly for people is when we're talking about techniques, using techniques that work, seeing if they work, and then using another technique later, and not making a technique part of your identity. So this is another mistake people are making. Just because something works for you at one stage in your life, it doesn't need to become your identity, that everything's about this now and that's the only truth forever and ever. Some things are generally true, some things aren't. Some things are true for you now and useful now. Some things are useless for other people now, but might be useful later. So it's complicated about when we're going to be talking about techniques, that's the way we'll be looking at it. We're not saying this is the only thing now. We're not saying these two things have to even go together. They might even, sometimes two techniques that contradict each other are useful. Sometimes even the concepts underlying the techniques contradict each other, but they're useful to alternate between them. It just depends what your goals are. So to go back to your question about the bodywork and left hemisphere stuff. Yeah, yes, in the sense of the dysfunctional left hemisphere, definitely. A lot of the benefit of getting into your body and sensations and feelings is useful in the sense that it can break apart a lot of the models in your head that are the bad maps that you have. You can get lost in that stuff, and I find it's just like going, you're just looking at the images and on the wall in Plato's cave kind of idea. You're seeing the images more clearly if you spend too much time with your sensations as a tool, a necessary tool for many people, many times. I just think it's a dead end if that's the only thing the person does. So the other thing I'm working on with the conscious movement practice is actually using what you would consider left hemisphere ways of thinking in order to change and control your movements. So understanding the mechanics and the relations between the parts, and being really making clear definitions about different parts, what the different parts mean, how they relate to another part. When I move, this part forward, what happens to this other part? So this is kind of unnatural, and it's not the way you want to. You can't feel all these things, but you can think about them intellectually. But then, when you come to do a movement, then you can use that understanding that you did earlier to change the movements you do now in the moment. So again, it's that thing of the process where you're going the whole to the parts to the whole. So I kind of think of what I'm doing now is more to tidy up what the left hemisphere does well, and the problems with it, and the sort of confabulating stories and stuff about yourself, like especially with like posture, people telling themselves, oh, feels a little bit better now, they're wriggling around in the chair, oh, it's quite good now, or I'm standing up straight, and then if you actually look at them standing up straight, they're lifting their chest at the front, their inner back is curved in, their head is back. They just look ridiculous, like a sergeant major guy, like an old stereotypical sergeant major with a puffed out chest. If you look at them from the side, they're bent backwards. They're actually shorter than they were before, literally shorter, but they feel taller. So that's the kind of I would consider that a confabulating story that people are telling about themselves. So you actually need to use your left hemisphere way of thinking in order to notice the patterns and to get out of your lying feelings and sensations for a while before you go back into them. And then you can do something, you're able to do new movements after. But in the moment of doing something, like even if it's something basic like standing up, you can change the way you stand by using it's like using analogies with either with mechanisms or analogies with sort of movements in nature, not all the things that are moving. They're outside. You can describe them in a kind of left hemisphere kind of way, but they're really in the moment they're outside of the left hemisphere. They're more right hemisphere or embodied or whatever, and they're kind of alive. But you can't. They're not word based. They're not word based. They're more image based or more they're just functioning as a whole basically. And I like to alternate between both of them in the practices that I do and the technique that I teach people. Different people attach more to one side than the other. So, for example, a very wordy intellectual person can be really good at understanding all the cause and effect relationships and the mechanics, and they can understand all that in the body. But then when they actually try to change the movements, they just can't do it. They just can't. They're just not in touch with themselves enough. They've never developed the kind of brain-body connections over the years, so they just can't really. They know what they want to do, but they can't do it. It's very frustrating for them. It's like they've written a great program, and then it just won't run properly. For whatever reason, so they get frustrated. But then there's another guy who's like totally in his body and feels it all, and it's like every little sensation is so important to him, and he goes into this romantic drama about every emotion. Oh, this means this, and I'm sensing this, and all this stuff. Those guys have really struggled to try and understand the cause and effect relationships, and they just can't focus on the different parts and how they combine, because it's kind of boring, reasoning, left hemisphere kind of thing. And then they're too busy trying to live in the whole and live in the now and feel it all, and then they can't do anything to change it either, and they have the same problem as the sergeant major guy. They just don't realize it. So like a guy doing meditation can be just as absurd posture as a sergeant major who's rigid. A guy can be more floppy and released muscles, and he's doing exactly the same thing, bending his lower back end, making himself shorter. This is very clear if you see someone from the side, from side on. So yeah, I have a complicated relationship with my left hemisphere and with my pupils' left hemispheres.
It was interesting. You mentioned definitions.
I was speaking with someone on Twitter about this, and they were saying that, and I like this guy, by the way. This is not a criticism, but as we were saying before, there's this definite tendency online, at least in our circles, towards just rejecting language kind of altogether. So as is typical with movements, you have a binary, and one group takes one extreme and the other group takes the other extreme. And there's rarely anyone in the middle who just moderates, the two views. But I was kind of making the argument that defining words properly, words that you use, things that you think are important, is actually a critical task. And very often we go around using words because they have an emotional effect that we like or whatever it is, but we don't actually particularly know what we mean by them. And the particular word we were talking about is power. We're talking about power because everyone's talking about the will to power with Nietzsche and, going to be really powerful and stuff. But I just thought to myself, well, I wonder if anyone actually has a personal definition of what power is. And this person made an interesting comment that they didn't think that necessarily you needed to have a definition, because it just is what it is. There's that verb to be. But I kind of made the argument that, you do probably need to clearly define your own terms. Otherwise, it's just kind of like this abstraction with a bit of an emotional attachment to it that feels good when you say it, or something like that. It's not actually an abstraction that has a purpose, or that's based in reality, or that you can use to properly describe a process that you are going through in the world. So it's interesting you mentioned that. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, in my work with Cal, in particular, the process that we went through together was actually mostly language based. And what I find very interesting about this, again, we'll just refer to it as left brain consciousness, or the left brain tyrant, I prefer, is that I'm just trying to think of the best way to describe it. It can actually short circuit itself. Now, this kind of sounds weird, but if someone is skillful enough with the way that they employ language, maybe I like the description that you're employing language like a hammer, because I have an aggressive outlook, probably, which that suits me. I like that. But he did realistically use it as a hammer. And without going into too much detail about the process, you obviously have the autobiographical self, and you state your memories and your life and what you think of it, what you think happened. And if you have someone skillful enough with the way that they can use words and manipulate emotional states that are associated with what they're going to do to you with these words, it can actually have the effect of short-circuiting the map that you have of yourself, which kind of seems in a way counterintuitive, that you can use words to lessen the impact of words. But it was actually a very interesting process to go through. And from there, I actually did some more work with no self stuff. And again, there are ways to approach the issue of no self, or of the powered down self, that are entirely language based. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a body based process. It can be a process of skillful language use. And obviously the person that is going through the process, when they're really into it and they're really doing it properly, they are having bodily reactions and sensations and all sorts of weird mind states. That's true. But nevertheless, words can be used in such a way that you can even have the realization or a glimpse of no self, which is typically something that's associated with meditating in a cave for 20 years. So words are very interesting. It's interesting hearing you describe how they kind of work. And I think that kind of measures up with your process in some ways, that they are kind of quite powerful, potentially, if used in the right way. And that kind of makes sense, because the autobiographical self is definitely tied up with the left hemisphere. We know that. So if someone is skillfully able to employ words in such a way that they're seeking to short circuit the ideas that you have of yourself, they can nevertheless be very effective. And the approach that I'm starting to try to use is to employ all these things together, because I think that they're all mutually reinforcing in a very excellent way. So the body work is one thing, because that's getting into your body and noticing yourself in all the ways that you describe. Or say with my breath work, it's powering down the worst elements of the sympathetic nervous system, which of course are all tied up with the left brain and how those things are emphasized. And I think that when you combine all these different things in a skillful way with the right context, you can have extremely powerful outcomes, and outcomes where significant self-change can be made very quickly, actually, which doesn't require you to do, Vipassana meditation retreats for 15 years or something. I don't think you need to go through that full-on long-term process, actually, to make significant progress in these different modalities. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as a general concept.
I'm going to come up with I'm going to give a hot take here.
Yeah.
I think people misunderstand what is happening when they do things like Vipassana and the kind of watch your sensations kind of insight meditation. I think people think, and this, based on what, just from listening to people, most people who are practicing who haven't got anywhere with it yet, you haven't reached it, whatever they want to call it in their tradition. And based on people who are teachers as well, who have got somewhere with it, it's almost like they think if you watch the sensations closely enough, you'll see into the nature of reality. So you'll see the truth eventually by watching it very, very closely. The closer you watch, then eventually you see what's really happening. That seems to be behind the sort of this seems to be the notion that many people have, not everybody. For me, I don't think that is what is happening. I don't think that one day you suddenly see it clearly and aha. I think what happens is it's a concept. Again, you have a concept of yourself, and the self-concept changes. Eventually, your brain just goes, "Oh, for fuck's sakes! I've been looking at this so many times now. This can't be the way it is," and it just kind of flips and changes. The structure of your changes, of your consciousness or your relation between you and the world, however you want to say it. So I think what's happening is, again, that's a concept you've come up to describe yourself when you were young. There's like a certain, this. You need it, you need some kind of ego self to exist in the world. The child is developing this, and then what these things are is to change your concept. But it's difficult to change this concept of yourself because it's not a concept. It's not a map you're looking at. It's the map you're inside. You are the map. You're inside this concept. The structure of the way you see things is an expression of this concept you have of yourself. So you need to change the concept. So there's definitely, I know there are ways to change it based on words and thinking and contemplating and seeing things in a different way, using with words that aren't staring at sensations. Because as I said earlier, you're not actually experiencing raw sensations anyway. You're experiencing perceptions. They're already... you've already abstracted out some things, but not all of what was going on. This Korzybski again. You have all sorts of quick perceptual judgments and things that are happening. And to take the Vipassana guys, the three characteristics. You're studying the sensations that make up your awareness to see the truth of the three characteristics. I'm not going to go into this a lot because I'm not an expert in this. But those characteristics are concepts. So if you're seeing the concepts, you're already out of sensations, raw sensations, and it's conceptual. It's like changing the concept. So I think this is why people can do decades and not get anywhere with it, because they haven't changed the concept. And this is why some people appear to just have a quick awakening or whatever. It's because they... for whatever reason, they were able to get out of that concept and into a new self-concept, which is probably wrong and limited also, but it's bigger than the old one or different from the old one, or your understanding of the relationship between what you think of as you and what you think of as the world is different. Many ways to talk about this, various stages of it. You have to figure out what stage people are at when they're talking about things, because some things seem to be true earlier and not later. Some things are just not true, but they're useful tools, tricks to get you to another stage. So when you were talking about the using words to deal with the changing the self, that's the way I think about it. Is you're trapped inside that map, and you need to change that map. And obviously, your left hemisphere is the one that's kind of making the maps. Korzybski's most important idea, I think, is the is the idea that for language to be, that the only kind of knowledge that we have is if your language is similar in structure to the world. So there has to be a structural similarity between the concepts and how they're arranged, and then the world and how it's arranged. And you only know whether these go together, whether these fit together based on doing things. That's how you find out, so it's kind of pragmatic in that sense. You don't need to go full philosophically pragmatic, but in that sense, you only know by doing things. So it goes right back to the reading versus action. You only know if what you're reading works and is true by doing something with it. And people get caught up in whether it was right and true or not. But if something changes in you and helps you, and then that's part of the process to where you're doing next, that book was useful to you, even if it's not quote true or quote right, or you think it's a bit cringe now. If you think of some of the books that affected you most during your life, there's probably a couple that are quite cringe to you now, but not then.
Yeah.
And you could also recommend to somebody young, because even though you don't agree with it all now, it's the right thing for them now. I don't mean that in like a patronizing way. I just mean a developmentally way. That's what they need next. I've had people come to me for work and I've sent them to somebody else that I think is incomplete, but they need to do that first before my thing would even make sense. Not that it's more advanced, it's just that it's different, and I'm basing on what stage they're at. Another guy would be better at what I'm doing than me if he spent his time doing it instead of what his own thing is. So it just depends. But the no self stuff, the self is a concept. It's a tool that you need at some point. You need to think of I, as I said earlier, about the child who, you learn to regulate your own behavior by regulating other people's first. So like you're giving, the way the little kid will give orders, they'll try and get people to do things. They're manipulating people's behavior using words. They're trying to get things, whether they just want something or whatever. They know how, they put the arm up and they get lifted up. They instinctively know these things, then they start using words to get what they want. And you over time you realize that, if I use words at other people, they will help me get what I want. So I could use words at me. So you tell yourself to do things, and then you find yourself doing the thing. You're like, you have this whole new realm of actions possible based on giving yourself orders, commanding yourself to do things. So it's like you've split yourself in two. There's the commander and there's the obeyer. And this is must be related to, the idea of the ego or whatever, but you need that to exist. This is how you regulate your own behavior and make yourself do things, that you make yourself stop doing things you want to stop in order to get what you want, or to start doing things that you need to do that you don't really want to do in order to get what you want. And this starts by using words to boss around other people, to tell other people to do, like the kid telling people this is how the game works and stuff. It all comes from that. And then you're just telling yourself. It's really interesting. It's not what you think it is. You think it's not like it was already inside you, and then you're just kind of expressing this doer guy. You have to construct this self, this doer guy. It has to be constructed at some point when you're young. And then people get lost in that and start thinking it's them, their whole self, their real self. And this is where all the problems come. And then this is why everybody's doing the spiritual practices, to get away from the problems of that. But to me, again, that's just a stage and a process that you need. And then by doing whatever practices, you transcend that, but it's still included. You're not like, if you really were to destroy the ego and have no self, in the normal living sense, you could only just sit outside a cave in underwear, getting food from people who walk by, and combed your big long beard for you or whatever. People do that. So that's not my thing. I probably could do that actually. I got really good at that kind of passive contemplation, meditation stuff for a while.
Yeah.
But you just don't do anything in the world. It's like, again, what's the point being mega enlightened if you're just sitting in a cave doing nothing? Unless you're like controlling world events based on the power of telepathy. Maybe there's 20 guys in caves doing that. I don't know. It's probably not you if you're listening to this. So You need to be doing something with this stuff. You know, it's like, what's the point in it? It's like, for what?
Because you're going to transcend samsara. You'll disappear into the ether and you'll cease to exist, because that's apparently what happens when you do that, which I'm skeptical of.
Do that every night anyway.
Well, exactly.
Do it every night.
Every time I go to the pub. So
Yeah.
just on that point, you mentioned something about vipassana in particular, and I've always, like, I'm a little bit mean to vipassana. So this is my hot take for the night or your day. Is this idea that, and this is all tied up with the self and the misunderstanding of what the self is, I believe. Well, actually, I don't believe it. I'm almost certain that this is the case. And vipassana is very, very popular. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that for a lot of people who are hyper rational and obsessed with words and all the stuff we've been talking about, is getting into your body and noticing what your body is doing is actually a beneficial thing. And, you know, there's things associated with getting into your body that, it does change the brain in certain beneficial ways over time. And I do think that people do still get something from it. But in terms of it being an efficient method of meditation, I've always been a little bit skeptical of that. And the reason I am is when I had my first real meditational insight. And let me just go into what that was. So when you start meditation, you sit there and you're taught to observe your breathing. That's the first thing you do. Then observe sensations, all those things you get taught. And particularly in Vipassana, it's very detailed. You have the Mahasatipatthana Sutta that sets out a very regimented, very military-like way of breaking down the body, certain meditations on the body decomposing and, all sorts of exotic stuff. And during maybe the first 10 years of meditation, I just remember very often becoming quite frustrated because I got into a position where I'd be sitting there watching things happen. So watching sensations, watching breath. And for all that time, I was kind of like, surely something has got to happen. Something's got to happen. Why am I doing this if nothing is happening? And this was interesting because I've heard from people that are in a similar position and have been in a similar position for like, they've been doing this for like 20 years, like observing these things in their body. And why I think Vipassana is not a particularly good system, at least as I understand it, and people in the comments can correct me if this is wrong, but it puts you in the position of an observer observing what is going on separate to yourself. So you are the homunculus behind your eyes, and you're computing, you're in your little computer room, and you're sitting there running scans of the body, which is separate to you sitting in the computer room. Now, in my opinion, if there is any purpose to mindfulness practice, it is to get outside of that frame. So what I've never been able to understand about Vipassana is why the emphasis on that position of noticing things as if you are a separate entity to the body that you're noticing. And the true magic of meditation and mindfulness is when you have the glimpse that there is actually no separation. And that's what people, increasingly refer to as non-duality practice. That's what it means. And I think that when you finally have that realization or that glimpse, as people tend to call it, that's a really momentous thing, because you have this moment where you're like, fuck, like I've literally just been sitting there in a state of delusion, like in the very delusion that I was meant to transcend and overcome. Like that thing is the problem. So I've always seen Vipassana about sitting there and focusing on sensations, like you're watching what's going on. That is the crux of the problem, is that. So I've since come to understand, and you may, I don't know what you think about this. This is my theory, that the religions like Buddhism that have all these rules and regulations, and they have like these rituals, and they have kind of certain ways of doing things, like what I've just described, focusing on breathing and sensation. I think that it's all a massive trick. And the reason I say that is because you can have this insight of non-duality after 20 years of doing that, and it could seem like the most momentous thing you could imagine. But it wouldn't have been momentous if you didn't have that 20 years of suffering to get to that point. Now when I meditate and I look at what I used to do, I'm like, fuck, I just can't even like understand why they made me sit there for that long to try and realize this. Like it just seemed mean or something. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I actually think that these religions are like a huge, like almost like a street magician. It's kind of like a trick. They're tricking you. So when you finally have that realization, it's really impactful. What do you think of that?
You mean like they build up the problem, so then it's more
exactly. So
the energies can
100%. So you're in this huge state of conflict, and then when you finally have the shift, it seems more impactful.
I'd imagine there's some of it's like that. It's also a trick in another sense. It's a trick in the sense that you have to engage with the delusions in order to escape the delusion in some way, because you have to work with what you have.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it goes back to it's a concept. You were talking about the homunculus and the sense of you being in there. So I mean, you have a concept there's me over here watching the sensations, and there's sensations happening over there, and then you realize that eventually that concept just breaks and a new one appears, and you change the concept. This is where actually it's not really that different from scientific understanding. You have to change it, create a new concept. They're trying to figure something out, and it doesn't seem to make sense like that. They have the facts and the things are happening. They have the theory about it that made sense until this point, and now it doesn't really make sense, and they just can't get it to fit with the new facts. And then eventually they just go, they have some kind of aha insight into, actually maybe it works in this other way. There's a new model for it, and then they kind of fill out the details of the insight. Like mathematicians will have they'll come to the solution, and then they have to work out the proof after. They don't do it in parts, bit by bit by bit, and then get the result. Usually, it's the big breakthroughs. It's the same for this kind of stuff. You have a kind of aha moment, and then you can spend, once you've had like some kind of realization, if it's a permanent one, you can spend a year or something where it's like working itself out, and things are becoming clearer. That's kind of just the new concept is unfolding in your life. And then that's another concept to transcend. And then how many is there? People have different theories. But at some level, you need a trick. And just for sheer practicality, you need a trick to get people in the door. You need some kind of hook. Absolutely. I mean, often people have a technique that will work if you just did the technique in a really matter-of-fact way, with no nonsense. But people won't come to it like that. It has to have like bells and whistles attached to get people in the door. So there's that level but that's for people good. If you really have something that works, you might have to do some of that. So some of that's definitely built into the religious stuff. Some of it is just misconceptions of old things that made sense, much more down to earth, practical, rational way. I have a theory. Can I do 2 hot takes in one episode?
Go for your life.
That the chakra system of the different areas of the body, I think that was much more to do with, it had a much more mechanical, positional purpose originally, way back before it became all the feelings and more mystical metaphors and things associated with the different parts. I think there's a way the body should be organized. I mean, I may just be interpreting this through my own stuff, obviously, now, because I'm interested in these things, but I think it's possible that it used to be much more practical and would make more sense, and then it became more mysterious later, and people have misconceptions. So a lot of that's in the religions as well. That's just, they don't know why it's there. Some of the stuff's just to get the person to behave in normal life enough so that they can do the practice to have the awakening without being a maniac or whatever, and a lot of the things, you're not meant to do the weird stuff until you're over 40. Because you're meant to prove yourself in the normal ego. You're meant to have a strong ego in the normal sense of being able to function in the world and regulate your own behavior and have some level of self-discipline and cope with reality and accomplish things. So some of it is to do with that stuff. Some of it is just making stuff more mysterious than it really is, for power, for definite. And also it depends on the culture and the people, the physiology of the people, the climate, the culture, the food. Some things, sitting down and doing one practice might only take a year for the people where it originated. But if you take someone from somewhere else, say the West, it's like hyper overly rationalized, overly left-brained in the dysfunctional sense, and then put them in that situation, then it might take much longer. So it kind of is cruel to do for them to one size fits all, like in that sense, and if someone has really strong emotional connections with a certain religion or a certain things, some people are better off escaping that and doing something completely alien to them and their culture to advance in the stuff. Other people are better engaging with that and using those words and concepts that are part of their whole being now, and they're deeply connected with their emotions and their physical reactions, and using that to overcome that. to using those concepts to overcome those concepts. So it really depends on the person and their mindset, and it depends on which practice is, how old, what other things they're doing, and the problem is online. The incentive is for everybody to, specialize, pick a niche, specialize in the niche, and then once you're the expert, then to just continue to be the expert in a specific thing, because that's how you make the money. And telling everybody this is the one thing that works, this one special trick will solve everything, and that's how it's all incentivized like that. Even for people who are good, even for people who are who are teaching something in good faith, it's incentivized in that way. Plus, obviously, it's a beacon for scammers and market like pure marketeers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. A couple of things there. So I agree with the chakra thing. I think that what I've noticed in my own work. So I've got this new thing where, as a part of trying to find the point of biological resonance, at least with breathing, which is when the breathing is aligned with the heart rate variability effectively. It's very complex. There's a lot that goes into it. But what I've started doing is because I'm a firm believer in the same way that you are, that the chakras are kind of like segments of the body that seem to be clusters in some way. I'm not sure how that fits together. Perhaps it's nerves or, there's something going on there. And probably from what you're saying, there's a biomechanical element to that as well, that I've not thought about.
Yeah. I think the actual positions of the chakras, there's key parts based on the model of optimal posture I'm working with. There are key parts of the body, and I'm talking about bony parts, the relative position of the bony parts, where it is in space relative to other parts, is it further forward or further back of this other bony part, etc. That there seems to be the key areas that I'm teaching in the posture model, which has a history and it's not my work, I'm using other people's work, it lines up with roughly where the chakras are. If you think of the chakras as like, instead of a sphere of light or whatever it is they think now, instead of like a sphere in positions, and then when people try to associate with science, they tend to go, okay, maybe that's some kind of nerve system in that area there or something. I don't mean that. I mean the mechanical positions of that area of the body. So rather than thinking of it as a physical three-dimensional sphere, if you think about that part of the body as like a horizontal plane, like if you were to slice through that part of the body, and then that should be in this position. Yeah, if you're segmented like that, in such a way like that things should be in certain positions relative to one another in order for just the mechanisms of the fascia and things to work properly. So I'm thinking it seems likely that people were more closer to that optimal posture at some point in the past, at some points earlier in the middle of civilizations, like we're talking last time. So they probably remember, they were closer to it, made more sense to them. And then over time, as people's bodies deteriorated, as their minds deteriorated, they just attached the other stuff later, which may or may not be true separately, but isn't the whole story about it. And then that becomes, like the part of people's identity. Now they're into those things and believe those things, when really those were just tools for people were like, why are we not in good physical condition as we used to be? Okay, this is the way your body should be. Okay, if you sit like this and do these things, then you can get back into those positions. Whereas now it's like you sit in those positions and you're to have the mystical awareness, whereas before it was to be even more in the physical world and successful in the practical world. Whereas now it's gone the completely opposite direction. It's to escape it, to hide from it.
Another thing about reading, right? So you could go and read a book on that, come away thinking, oh, well, the fucking crown chakra, man, and like do all this stuff. And you could be completely fucking deluded. It's kind of funny. in a way.
Totally.
So, as I was saying, so in my work, and, I'm a massive self-experimenter as you are. So I've been using my own tools on myself, probably more than anyone else. And a couple of things I've noticed. So you're talking about the postural integrity in terms of, how these segments are meant to sit in relation to one another. Another way you could look at it, I think, is the vascular system, which is no doubt tied up with posture. I'm sure it is now because I've seen the effect of it. And the way that blood is pumped around the fascia and the body and the muscles. And what's very interesting about, so I've been using this Reichian kind of model about, progressively relaxing each of these segments together. So, for example, the face, the throat, chest, pelvis, feet kind of thing in the traditional and Reichian way of doing it. And what's fascinating is the speed of which the heart rate variability and the blood pulse that gets pushed around the body and its volume, the way those things come into alignment and how quickly they do by utilizing this progressive relaxation as per, quote unquote, the chakras is incredible. And it works better than anything I've used yet, which you might be interested.
To go back to what we were saying earlier, I love this. What we were saying earlier is you couldn't do what you just did without words. So you did the practice, you're doing the physical feeling stuff, and then you sort of detach from that. You take a step back, or you take a view from above. Then you start looking at some data and stuff, but you don't get lost in the data about that. You don't obsess over what the heart and the breath thing said and think that's it. Then you're going back into the practice again. You've got more information, and now that what you learn after breaking it into parts using words and concepts, it comes back into the whole, and the whole is now bigger than it was before. This is what I meant earlier about the whole to the parts to the whole. Everyone's just throwing away the parts bit. A load of people will find what you said annoying. They'll think that if you're doing breathing, these things, you should just be getting into the body and living in the now, man, feeling all this stuff, and you should be
energy and stuff.
That science stuff is so stupid. Yeah, you should be into all that, and the science stuff is just like that's getting in the way, and that's the problem. The intellect's the problem. Like people will say, like the mind is the problem. I mean, people say stuff like that. Okay, cool. Mind, body, and spirit without a mind. Good luck with that. So what you're saying, I definitely think the posture and the breathing stuff are two sides of the same coin. Maybe over time we'll be able to kind of integrate the two things we're doing and see where they fit together, which would be cool. Yeah,
because I'm working through your course, and so I've not gone too far with it because I've been busy, but so I've tried all different positions. So I've tried lying down, semi-lying down. I've tried like my Zen Caesar posture. I've tried standing up. So I've tried everything. I've tried different forms of relaxation. And by far the most effective is sitting in a meditational posture, which is very interesting as well. So it makes you think, why the Buddhists originally did this, but that just goes to show. So sitting in a meditational posture, breathing in a very specific way that I won't go into here, but a specific rhythm with into a certain section of the body. But the posture is critical. And what I've noticed is if you even put the posture off kilter a little bit, it completely changes the result. And I just love to do more work on this as I get deeper into the posture stuff, which is not something I've done much of. But I guess what I'm saying is, as you were saying before, we shouldn't reject science at all, because it really is just a tool. It's kind of like a tool that you can see into yourself more effectively. The vascular system is extremely important. And I'm seeing how it's important in real time. And even with the work I do, I use biofeedback mechanisms with people. And again, that's a left brain activity. So they're sitting there watching themselves and they're synchronizing their biology with what's going on, what they're observing to go on. which I think is exactly what you're doing as well, isn't it? That's pretty much bang on. It's observing yourself and what's really happening, as opposed to just...
Yeah, I mean, it's the two things. It's the experiential experiments where you're doing things as a whole in the world, you know, and then there's the understanding that you're deluding yourself all the time. We're not designed, you know, we talked about in the last episode, you know, we're not designed to be pure truth creating machines, although we're designed to think we are. So you need to have some kind of objective way to measure and to track what it is you're doing. And then you go back to doing the thing in the world again. Lots of people who are into like self-experimentation, if you look this up online, I mean, a lot of people are obsessive over they're data freaks, and they're lost. They're just intellectual types who are lost in the data again. They're not really that. They don't live. They're not really. That's where their focus is. So they're more kind of stuck in the intermediate step, as I was saying earlier. So. One thing you were saying about the meditation position being better for it, it's gravity. Gravity is central to how we're designed, how we're built. The whole of my posture, the model I use for posture, is based on using gravity to using movements based on an understand using gravity in such a way, moving in such a way that you can use gravity to lengthen and stretch the fascia so it starts to act like springs, and then the springs are what help you sit up and move around and things. Everyone has them, but we're not using them because they're, you know, the way we have degenerate structure, the way we move the body parts together. So a lot of the work is to changing the way people move the body parts in order to make this happen, but it works with gravity. So you can't do it lying down. You can do other things lying down, obviously. But it's designed for being vertical. That's what we are, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
The crown chakra is pointing up. I mean, this is like a lot of the stuff they talk about the crown chakra. It's metaphors for the fact that you're vertical on a planet with your head pointing up towards the light. You know, the sun and the stars. You know, it's like these are like there's like deep mechanical understandings in these things, and everyone's got lost in the kind of fluffy, more mystical, flowery stuff. There may be, in some ways, truth to some of these things, but that's not the main thing. Again, it's just a different way to split yourself up, what people are doing. So yeah, I mean the posture. I mean, just in a sort of normal sense, posture will affect your breathing. If you're slumped down at the front of your slouched at your desk, you don't breathe as well. I mean, people will notice this consciously. If you might even notice if you try and stand up straight and puff up your chest, you can't breathe that good either that way. No. So it's not like, but people think that that's a good posture, but it isn't the good posture. That's a longer story. So
but
having,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, having something like we're using where you have a objective methods. So for me, it's using videos and analyzing the videos and stuff. So obviously in real life, you're not going to be walking around with little video clips and diagrams on the videos in order to move. It's like autist madness. Somebody can do it, I'm sure, so let me know. But the point is, you use that briefly to understand it better and then to change what you're doing in the whole. It's whole to the parts to the whole. It's the thought, feeling, idea, aims, goals, purposes, to the breaking it into parts with words and concepts and stuff, and then back to the whole life again. And everyone wants to pick one or the other, but you need the process of going back and forward.
Absolutely. One of the metrics I've been measuring is heart rate variability, particularly because it's being studied a lot at the moment, particularly in terms of longevity, in terms of just general functioning day to day, and health outcomes over the term of our lives. And it's positively correlated. If you have a good heart rate variability, you live for longer. If you have a bad one, you don't live for longer. And it's super interesting because I've been tracking it in myself in different positions, different postures, taking data, being hyper intellectual, but and also engaging in activities, like kind of activities, being online, other stimulatory activities. And what I've noticed is, for example, being online is extremely negative for it, even with a good posture and a good rhythmic breathing pattern. And just being stimulated in general is not particularly good for it. But when you have these moments where you're not doing much and just sitting there being bored, I think that being bored is underrated. And what I've noticed is when you have those moments where you can just sit there and relax and kind of be bored, the heart rate variability tends to be very good because you're sitting there in a reasonable posture, breathing properly, just kind of relaxing. I think that, a big thing is with words and reading and being on the internet and being hyper stimulated all the time, the more metrics that I look at, the more destructive I see these habits as being. And I often wonder about people's longevity, actually, this generation, because most of the things I think that are associated with technology, which could be slouched posture, reading tweet storms, things that probably anger you as well. So you're not relaxed. You're in an angered, sympathetic state. The light pollution, just all these various things all add up to what I've observed to be extremely poor metrics from a circulatory perspective, which I think, at least with heart rate variability, is related to the nervous system and how it's functioning. And of course, we could go into all the downstream effects of this, like hypertension and various other problems that plague the West. But I guess maybe there's a slightly different angle on how words and reading and some of these activities can have a really negative impact on some metrics that I've observed. And I guess you see that in kids, right? They're on Instagram, they're on their phones all the time, and they're all depressed, apparently. That's what people tell me. I've never seen a study on it, but people are disconnected, they're mental, and most of them don't really have any idea about what's going on. So bringing things back to the body in that way, I think is very useful.
And
you also have a map of your body, like you were talking about Korzybski earlier. I mean, you have maps of the territory. You're never going to have a map of the whole territory. You just need but the structure needs to be right. So for people's breathing, their understanding of the breathing I'll talk about posture because I know more about that than the breathing, but their understanding of the structure is the map they have in their head, which kind of just developed spontaneously or randomly during their life. And if it's incorrect, if it doesn't match the reality in my work using the fascia, stretching the elastic fascia so it functions as a spring, that's that's an objective thing you can see in the movements. If you don't find a way to change to change the map of where the different parts should be relative to one another, so if you've got a map of 3 cities and the cities are the wrong, east, middle, west, and the cities are the wrong way around, the map is useless. If they're the right way around, it might be totally basic and it's 3 dots on a piece of paper, but at least it's a good map, the order of the cities. At least there's a little bit of information in it. Some people think that certain body parts should be in front of another body part, so they have the cities in the wrong place. And most of this is out of awareness. Most of this is assumed. Some of it's just feelings. It feels like these parts feel like they should be in certain positions, and if you try and change them, it feels wrong straight away, just because of pure habit. So in that sense, you have to learn to. You have to sometimes use the maps to force yourself to not change the territory, but to have a new insight into what the territory is, and then you change the map. Again, people become attached to each map, and it becomes their identity, and it's very hard to let some of these things go. That's a skill in itself, is to be able to jump from map to map without going mad, without trying to necessarily integrate them all. You can, or some things can, some things can't. I mean, like if you take 2 practices, whether it's like body work practices or whatever, they may look similar from the outside. They're doing certain things with the body and it looks similar from outside, but the practices themselves are embedded within a whole framework of concepts, and things have different meanings. They have different meanings to the teacher, different meanings to the pupil, they have different, or patient, they have different meanings over time that change within the person. And sometimes the concepts of the two practices completely contradict each other, even if the practices look similar. So sometimes the concepts don't matter and you can throw them away and just do the practice. Other times you can't. That will interfere with the results because your understanding of it, you have a wrong concept of what it is you're actually doing. So then you've got all the wrong concepts you have about your body and your self already. You learn some practices that you can often your layers of more wrong concepts that you cultivated during your life that then later you have to get rid of, but you don't realize at the time. This may be a phase everyone has to go through. And then eventually, well, in my case, as I got older, I started to become better at leaving things in their own place. Okay, I can do this practice for this thing, this one for that thing. I don't need to try and fit them together, and I can kind of keep them separate as separate maps, because I have a new map which is the one where I can use different maps for different things. So that's like a kind of meta map or whatever. Just I'm sounding like a total wanker now, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, interesting.
So I think we can look at maybe some final words, and what you're saying there is, and what we've been talking about is made me think of a couple of things. So I just kind of want to tie it back, because one of my main interests is this idea of no self. It's something that I've looked at a lot, and something that I've written about a lot as well. The main reason I kind of want to talk about it before we leave is because I think that even though we've spoken about it tonight in some detail, I still think it's something that people have difficulty trying to understand. Many people I've seen just insist black and blue, that they have a self, and I'm insane. And of course, we've had the great no self wars between various online Buddhist interests who have argued very vigorously with one another about the fact that there is an immortal self. And for my own part, I don't really see how that's possible. And much of the reason I don't see how it's possible is because of this left brain, right brain dichotomy, and how the self is a concept and language-based evolutionary feature that hypothesizes, categorizes, and creates maps, I think, as you were just saying. And, you know, when I was taught these sorts of things by people like Cal and various Zen teachers, that this kind of concretized self, I think it derives most of its concretized existence, which is to say its stultified, rigidified existence, the way that most people go through life operating from the left brain, from language and reason. And this primarily kind of derives, I think, from maybe self-narrative, which is something that we all run, of course. And obviously that then is to do with the default mode network and this left brain dominance, I suppose, that most of us in the West have. And I think what's very useful about body work, and what's very useful about taking a step back and trying to understand a little bit better what language is and how that relates to yourself, is that the idea of no self and everything we've been talking about today is very much tied up for these reasons, and that all these practices and all these analysis can kind of go together, and you can really loosen yourself up. You can start to break free of patterns and various other things that may be holding you back, behaviors, and, you know, other things that you're not satisfied with. And there's a real advantage in powering down the self for this reason. It's almost necessary to do it, because this concretized self is very much a thing that is getting in your way, I believe, to a large degree. So bringing it back to the topic at hand, I think the general point that I'm kind of trying to get across is that language, and by extension, these activities to do with it, such as reading and philosophy, philosophizing and philosophy, when not properly understood, I think that it ends up diminishing your power as a person. And I'm going to tie it back to the conversation I was having with this individual about the definition of what power is. Because I think that for me anyway, what power is to me is our ability maybe to act and kind of act and think in space and time with flexibility, and to be able to overcome yourself internally as efficiently as possible if yourself is getting in the way of what you're trying to do, which it often does. And it seems to me that despite what many people have read, that if you read a book, that in effect you're not really able to do this any more than what you were before. Even if you read a book on no self or some kind of related subject, is that trying to get over all these self-conceptions and all these self-concepts, it's simply not able to be done by just reading a book, because it is itself a product of the very same process, in my opinion. So looking at it in this way, I think that in this podcast coming up, we're really going to be involved in a doctrine, I guess, for lack of a better word, a doctrine of doing and experiencing, and kind of increasing our power through acting in an operational way, in an experimental way, as a self-experimenter. And in that sense, we're going to try to use language in a way that is operational and that does complement this kind of general idea of fixing up the physiology, fixing up the non-linguistic parts of the body, and then becoming a bit more judicious with our use of language, and that we start to see language in its proper context, which I think is very important. And all these things, I hope tonight you've seen that they can all be used together, and they can all mutually reinforce one another when they're used properly, efficiently, and intelligently. So I just wanted to leave everyone with that. I don't know if you got any comments or last words, Kevin, that you wanted to get across.
No, this is good. You summed it up well.
Very good. Well, that's an hour and 47. So I guess thanks for tuning in, everyone. And yeah, I believe, Kevin, you got a series on posture coming up, which I look forward to. So
yeah, I'm writing a lot now on the Substack and daily. So we'll see what comes of it. I might make a book out of it eventually, but yeah, there'll be there'll be multiple series. One of them will be about posture, and some other things.
So what is it? You're doing like 100 in 100 days or something? It's like kamikaze stuff.
Yeah, that's the plan. They'll be small. Some of the things will just be commentary on quotes and things, but it's things I just need to. They're not happening because I'm waiting for. Being a bit of a perfectionist about putting them into bigger essays or book or whatever, but really I should just put them out there and then I can collate them later. That's the plan anyway.
Yeah.
And then plus it's making me do it because I already almost missed yesterday, which was day 2. So this is quite good training for my own discipline. Yeah.
Well, I look, the first one was good, being a self-experimenter. I don't know if you noticed, but I stole that in my last part there. So it was a good article.
Well, I mean, that's something we're going to be talking about a lot here because it sounds kind of dry or cold or whatever, but it's actually just a way of living. It's not taking everything at face value, not believing the things you're told, but not try to be a conspiracy guy about it. Just figuring it out for yourself and learning from other people, and then try to integrate it with your own thing as quickly as possible, and kind of a system for figuring it out. And what I realized was you can't just become a self-experimenter like that. You have to apply it to something. You have to do something with it, and then once you've done it with something, it becomes quite easy to do it with other parts of life.
Yeah, it's kind of defining why you're doing it. Again, it's this definition thing. And I think for me anyway, the definition is to be able to live a good life. As cheesy as that sounds, but you can't get too tied up with stuff because, you're going to die soon. So you might as well untie yourself and try to enjoy things.
And we discovered today I'm dying sooner than you. So yeah, I better work harder and expect.
I don't know, with my Australian drinking habits, maybe not. But then again, you are Scottish, so if anyone's going to give me a run for my money, it's you.
Half our listeners thought we were Irish and South African.
Yeah.
So now they've had their own aha change of concept.